Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. So, today I want to talk about a very specific skill, a very specific technique that I don't remember ever getting any formal training about. And so, if you also don't remember getting any formal sort of training or support around this podcast is for you. And that is interrupting our patients. So, the reason that I bring up this topic is that it actually comes up a solid amount, whether I'm teaching residents or I'm coaching or teaching clients. Um, there is a dearth of discussion about how to interrupt, when to interrupt, um, methods to use when interrupting our patients. And when I think back on some of my training, what I most remember is, and it wasn't like an intentional message, but it kind of was just, first of all, there wasn't any like active training on it. And then, like, the main thing I remember about like interrupting your patients is that it was like really mean and rude and not patient centered of you if you were interrupting. Did anyone else notice that or like have the same messaging? Like the thing that I recall on multiple occasions being told, often in the context of like the patient-centered clinical model or things like that, is this study that exists. I actually didn't look up that study and when it was done, but there's a study that exists that a physician interrupts their patients on average 18 seconds into an encounter. And I recall like another feature was like men interrupted sooner than that, women interrupted slightly later than that, like male versus female physicians. But it was still like everyone was interrupting your patients under a minute into it on average. And the way that this study was cited was sort of like, so don't be like that. Actually listen to your patients. And if you interrupt them, that's bad. And this is like one of these things where like the best intentions, maybe it makes sense. 18 seconds, like not a lot has happened by 18 seconds in for sure. And so like giving patients space to even a few minutes of sharing before interrupting like could be super valid and make sense. But I know my little perfectionistic people pleasing brain heard that and said, I'm never allowed to interrupt a patient. I am a conflict averse, people pleasing gal through all my socialization and upbringing and conditioning. That is where I'm starting. And so now I'm like, oh, I'm not never allowed to interrupt patients, apparently. And what this leads to is this phenomenon that I know is not just me because I hear about it from learners and clients and peers, is you feel like a patient is sharing a lot with you. Perhaps they are just like their personality is more verbose. Maybe they have a lot on their plate, or like whatever the reason is, certain patients can be chattier than others. And you feel trapped. You know you're well beyond the allotted time for your visit. You know you have stopped listening because you are overwhelmed, because you are distracted, like whatever it is. And yet a lot of us feel like we aren't allowed to interrupt our patients. It will be seen as rude. It will be seen as being one of those paternalistic jerk doctors that doesn't care about them. And so we just sort of take it until they stop and then we can finally leave 40 minutes later or whatever, right? And this is a sensation that serves no one. Whatever it is, whether it's about interrupting or something else, if you are feeling trapped in a room with a patient, that is serving neither you nor the patient, because the sensation of feeling trapped means like your nervous system thinks you are not in charge of your body. And even if you're doing your best to remain calm and at least sort of neutral with your patient, something is happening in there where your socialization or whatever reason it is that your brain interprets that you are not allowed to leave this room until your patient gives you permission, now puts your patient just like psychologically as like your captor. And I just, from personal experience, I can cite, I don't do my best medicine out of that place. I I get shorter, I get snappier, and because I'm like protecting myself from this like monster that's trapping me in a room. I'm not saying I cognitively, rationally think that, but my nervous system thinks that if I'm feeling trapped. And so I want to give you the idea of like cooperative, compassionate interrupting as a way to release you from that particular way of being trapped. I'm sure there's like other ways. And if you have like another way, you're like, I always feel trapped in the room with a patient when this is going on or when I'm in this state of mind, feel free to email me or DM me on Instagram or whatever, and I'll make an episode about that. I'm happy to do it. But I think for a lot of us, it's about we don't feel like we can interrupt. And we got to take that skill back. We got to find a way to do it. And from a place where we're doing it in a way that feels like we are not at odds or antagonistic against our patients, not because we're good or bad when we do that, but it just feels terrible to feel like you're in a constant like tug of war, fight for your life with your patient, right? Really, this human has come to you seeking some amount of support or something, and you are there to offer whatever support you can. In an ideal situation, this would not be antagonistic. This would not be combative. This would be cooperative, co-creative, right? And one way you get there is through interrupting. So, I actually was like I have my own sort of ideas and material I'm going to share at the end of this podcast, about some ideas of how to do this interrupting and like when you could facilitate it. But I also first wanted to just share that like I was Googling around trying to find this initial study that had sort of haunted my residency and my early training about like, don't interrupt or it means you're a bad person. So now you're just trapped in rooms forever. Right. And I found this new study that I just have to share. I'm going to share just like a couple snippets of it and like read it out because it actually affirms and adds to what I like the original study that I had sort of handed to me earlier. Um, so the name of the study is Physicians and Patients Interruptions in Clinical Practice, a Quantitative Analysis, and it's by Ilona Plug et al. They appear to all be PhDs, some MDs are in there. And it was actually just in the annual annals of family medicine last year, 2022, in the fall. And so I was delighted to find this study because it's actually what gave me some of the terminology I'm using around interruption. My initial idea for this podcast was compassionate interruption because that's like kind of the concept I've used. This study is the one that gave me the term cooperative interruption, cooperative interruption, because and I like that as an additional component to compassionate interruption. Compassionate interruption still is an important term, I think, because it points to the fact that when we interrupt, we can be doing so from a place of compassion for ourselves and the patients. And it's when we're holding compassion for both those people at the same time that our interruptions can feel good and be really effective. And I think alongside that sort of cooperative interruption, again, just almost speaks to the function and the usefulness of interruption in a given encounter. So I actually just want to like read to you some of what they say, like just some snippets, some excerpts of the study, because I think it's kind of great. And it was healing for me to read it. So I'm hopeful it's healing for you to hear it. Okay. So this part's from the introduction. Physicians' interruptions during medical visits have been found to occur after an average of just 18 seconds. These instances of overlapping talk that break the rule of one speaker at a time have long been considered as negative actions that inhibit patient symptom presentation and participation. Evidence shows that interruptions can be supportive or cooperative in the interaction, however. A cooperative interruption preserves the content and flow of the interaction. For example, the physician may establish common ground by requesting clarification. And I'm just going to pause my reading and just like make a comment about that, which is that that's absolutely true. I find that there can be times, whether early in the encounter or one of my sort of compassionate interruption techniques that I find to be really helpful, especially if the patient's going in like 50 million different directions and I'm feeling overwhelmed. So I know we've got to like cut the script because like I'm not even tracking anymore. If I say something around like, hold on, I just need to clarify a couple things. This is important that I clarify. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. So I'm interrupting, I'm cutting them off, I'm taking the stage, but I'm doing so for clarification. As the study cites, this could be pro-social. This could be very helpful, both to myself, but also to the patient. When a patient's running in 50 million directions, probably they're anxious or afraid or angry or something, and their brain's running a mile a minute, interrupting that script can actually be super, super therapeutic for them. So the thing I like that the study does is it makes distinctions between different kinds of interruptions. That way, yes. So like we just talked about, there are cooperative kinds of interruptions. And so we don't have to be always ashamed or feel bad if we've interrupted. We can now get more nuanced. So it's not saying like interrupt all the time, it's always great. No, like there's certain kinds of interruptions that are what they call intrusive. And they're about to give an example. I'll read that part. But there's another kind of interruption that's actually cooperative, that's helpful, that can be even therapeutic for the patient. And just like, so you don't have to feel bad about interrupting, period. You can then get more nuanced of like, ooh, was this interruption effective? Like, it's not about being good or bad. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about like, did this particular interruption serve its purpose? And like reflecting on it afterwards, right? Okay, so moving on in what I was reading. Intrusive interruptions, such as topic changes and disagreements, are perceived as more negative, typical interruptions than cooperative interruptions, such as clarifications or agreements. So, an example that they say an intrusive interruption impairs the content and flow of the interaction, when, for example, when a physician changes the topic. The thing I will say, like even them using the word interactive, there may be a time where it's like, it's time to change the subject, right? I would offer that if you can think of a cooperative way to change the subject, it could still count. I think it's interesting to think of, is this interruption only like purely intrusive where you don't at all reflect that you have heard anything that's come before? Or is it cooperative? You're saying, I hear you. We need to move on. We need to change the topic. I want to make sure we have space for this other piece. So I want to wrap this up. Like these are all examples of how you could be naming that the flow of the encounter, it's time for it to shift, but in a way where when you kind of keep cooperation, compassion top of mind, they can remain quote unquote positive or like pro social. And I think that's just so lovely to add nuance to the whole physicians shouldn't interrupt conversation. Like, what if physicians and other clinicians, of course, I know not just physicians listen, but like clinicians of all kinds, what if it can be actually cooperative, compassionate, therapeutic for us to interrupt? It's about using that particular tool in a mindful way, in a way that makes sense, in a way that honors the person's story, and isn't simply about ignoring everything they've said before, right? I'm not going to read this entire study, of course. I am going to name, they have different things about like gender differences, which is sort of interesting as well. And the other thing that they do is they talk about how often patients interrupt physicians in this case. And I think that's really interesting. The other thing that the study talks about is like they divide a patient encounter into two parts. What's the name of it? They talk about like the first phase being the problem presentation phase, like what we would consider like subjective, objective parts where we're gathering all the information. And then they have the second phase, which they call discussing a diagnosis or treatment plan, sort of the planning phase. And they're talking about how the reasons why or how often you interrupt in each of those phases can change. I'm not going to get into all the details. It's an interesting read if you like thinking about that. I just like thinking about how, yeah, it's useful to think about how you are the chair of the meeting of this, and the patient helps populate your agenda, and you are the timekeeper of that meeting. And part of your job can be both out of compassion and support for yourself and your patient to like have the discussion flow along, gets your facilitation skills going, right? So I wanted to read the next part, which was like some of the results. So now I am reading the study again. Okay. Although physicians' interruptions of patients have long been considered intrusive actions that should be avoided, our findings demonstrate that most of the interruptions physicians make are actually not intrusive. Rather, our study provides empirical evidence for previously described empirically untested intuitions that some interruptions are cooperative actions that may actually enhance the medical interaction. There you go. Isn't that interesting, right? So, getting even more specific, In slightly more than one half of the consultations in our data, physicians made the first interruption after an average time of 36 seconds, which is longer than the previously reported 18 and 23 seconds. The physicians in our study mainly interrupted patients to express understanding and support or to ask for clarification, thereby aligning with the patient's ongoing narration. And thus, with the patient's role as the primary speaker. So you're not trying to take the mic back for them. You actually are just almost like their support, their hype person, but helping facilitate what they're sharing with you in a way that's beneficial for both of you, right? That was me, just if it wasn't clear. Okay, back to what I'm reading. Hence, physicians' cooperative interruptions in the initial phase of the consultation may actually improve rather than hinder the quality of communication. There you go. So good. And then the results they talked about, male, female. An interesting thing in there is that they did notice this result indicates that physicians in our data did not more frequently intrusively interrupt women's stories than men, and women physicians were not more often intrusively interrupted than men physicians. So I did think that was interesting. In our data, men physicians and women patients were most likely to make intrusive interruptions, and women physician and men patients were most likely to interrupt in a cooperative manner. Regarding patients, these findings may indicate that women patients participate in medical interactions more assertively than men patients, although it could also be interpreted as a result of women patients feeling less heard and understood in medical interactions, right? And I mean, depending on your lived experience or politics, I have theories about which one is more likely for a lot of female patients for sure, which I can hold with compassion. And then, yeah, with regard to physicians, our finding is that women physicians use more cooperative interruptions than men physicians, and that is in line with previous research on physicians' patient-centeredness and supportive turn-taking. I just thought that part was kind of interesting. I'm not here to pit the genders against each other per se, but I just thought that part was kind of interesting, so I thought I would share that with you. Okay, two more paragraphs I want to read out for you, and then I'm going to just discuss more of my own thoughts about it. Okay. So, our study is the first to explore interruption behavior in two important consultation phases. Physicians and patients use interruptions for various purposes, which reflect the particular tasks and opportunities for each. Our findings show that physicians are less likely than patients to intrusively interrupt the other in the phase of problem presentation, which indicates that the physicians in our study acknowledge the control of the patient in this initial and critical phase, right? So if the patient's story gets to be heard, they get space held around what they've come in for. On the other hand, in the phase of diagnosis and or treatment plan discussions, physicians made almost as many intrusive interruptions as patients, which suggests more tension or time pressure and a repeating exercise of authority in taking and keeping the conversational floor. I just really like that turn of phrase. I wanted to read that. The sense of that tug of war. So that potentially the tug of war for these physicians was still happening more often at the end, and time pressure and other things that may have been going on may be the case. That's really fascinating. I have a theory that we also can really share that conversational floor with our patients, even in some of these other pieces. Sharing in diagnosis, sharing in treatment plans. And actually, I have found as I started to consider co-creation, what do you think the diagnosis may be? What are your ideas for the treatment plan? A lot of it just feels more cooperative instead of this tug of war anyway. So I wonder, and this is just I'm sure I do more interruption of like, okay, now we're wrapping it up, something that could be considered more directive and taking the floor back at the end, because sometimes for myself and the patient, the visit just has to end and I will take the reins for that, in terms of like power dynamics. But a lot of what they're talking about here, I wonder if we continue to move towards like collaborative ways of discussing treatment plans and diagnosis. In my opinion, they don't take longer. A lot of, times where it seems like the patient's unsatisfied and wants to keep the encounter going is because potentially they haven't been fully heard in these phases of the plan. So it's something to consider, like maybe as that opens up more, they would even find less intrusive interruptions in this part of the plan. Who can say? But at the end of the day, I even think like intrusive interruptions in terms of like ending the encounter, leaving the room, if time is up, if your brain is up, it could be actually okay. It could still be ultimately a cooperative, compassionate thing to do if really you're at the end of the time. You're at the end of your capacity, right? I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But I have one more paragraph I want to read before I dive into just like my discussion section. Okay. So last paragraph, conclusions. Physicians and patients' interruptions are often cooperative actions that may actually enhance the clinical interaction and subsequently the physician-patient relationship. Especially in the phase of problem presentation, physicians' interruptions to show agreement or to ask for clarification acknowledge the patient in their role as primary speaker, recognize the content of the patient's story, and demonstrate engagement in the interaction. So I just like, for me reading this, it was so interesting to add nuance to the old like physicians interrupt so fast story, right? And also gave me so much more like language and nuance around like the pro-social nature of interruptions and like just that they can be really useful. Like my first question like reading this study is like, "Oh, we should be talking about this study more." And I know it just came out in 2022, so maybe that's why it's like just a little over a year old. But let's start talking about this one more, folks. Anyone who's listening to this podcast, especially if you have anyone who's like, okay, so we're going to talk about communication with the patients, try not to interrupt them. Because, there's the old study that shows that physicians interrupt within the 18 seconds. You can be like, I heard of this updated study where it was more like 36 seconds. So obviously that needle is shifted. And a lot of times, more than half the time, the interruptions were cooperative, were patient-centered interruptions. And just like not to like be like, gotcha, whoever says it, but just to like nuance the conversation. Let's start to nuance that conversation more. We need a different bar than like no interruptions. Let's talk about whether the interruptions ended up serving their purpose. Did they end up creating better sense of like therapeutic alliance, connection? Also, especially if you're on a day where like therapeutic alliance and connection is just like not top of mind for you because you're having a pretty burnt out day, did those interruptions actually get you out of the room faster? Because I know a lot of us, when we are not in our most patient-centered state because we are burnt out, because we're tired, it's the last patient encounter of the day. I will say I've definitely experienced where I think interrupting earlier to try and like force the conversation along ends up blowing up in my face because the patient doesn't feel heard and then I'm in the room for longer. So both from a patient perspective, patient impact, as well as our impact perspective, it's not saying no interruptions, but it's just getting curious about which interruptions, when and how do we find to be more effective, right? So why do we need to actually develop our skills in cooperative and compassionate interruption? It's for our patients to feel heard and seen. And when our patients feel heard and seen, they're more in alliance with us. They're more likely to be honest with us. They're going to, be honest if they're going to do something or not. All those good things, right? And we need to develop these skills for us, if for nothing else, so that we understand that we are in control of our bodies, our brains, our attention, our time. That trapped feeling I talked about at the beginning, like that is honestly the most important reason why we need to really like practice some good, solid interrupting, intentional, cooperative, compassionate interrupting for ourselves first, and also therefore for our patients. Yeah. So you might be thinking like, okay, that's all nice. I can see sometimes maybe you're now reflecting like, I guess I do some of that cooperative interrupting already. I'll say, go on, or, ask a question. But like, there's still the times where I feel like I can't. How do I know when it's the right moment to like interject? When is it the right moment to interrupt? Right. And the first thing I will say is that it's definitely a construct that there's a right moment. But underneath it, what we often mean is like a moment that the patient will never be offended. That's tricky because we are not in charge of our patient's opinions or emotions. But so it can't be about how they will receive it. It's really got to be about like, what are my internal cues that it might be time to say something? So the one internal cue is if you're feeling trapped. And ideally, before you're feeling trapped. But if for now you're just like, I feel trapped in every patient encounter, I never know how to end them, I'm just relieved when they leave, we'll start with that and work our way backwards, right? So sort of an earlier than trapped could be if you just notice that you're struggling to pay as close attention, because that's a sign that like your brain and body are reaching their energetic, focus, emotional capacity. If there's a lot coming at you, like certainly those are times where the patient is really doing the fire hose in terms of both emotions and or like story, lots of details, often because they are very anxious or they are sad or like whatever, like they have an intense emotion that's fueling the rate of words coming out of their mouth, right? That can feel like, well, I can't interrupt in any part of that because that will be rude, it'll be unkind, it won't be so cooperative, it will be intrusive. Maybe our brains are thinking that, right? But really, like, if the rate at which they are delivering the story to you is outstripping your ability to follow it, it is compassionate. It is cooperative to be like, hold on, I'm losing you. Hold on. I don't want to miss any part of the story. Right. And so I would say that's a really good one because often I think the times when I think the examples from like clients or students and even like myself, it's usually those cases where someone's very scattered and saying lots of different things in lots of directions, or they're speaking very intensely and it's hard to get a word in. That's where we have to be a little bit more assertive sometimes and really be like, hold on, right? And those ones can feel very scary to practice if you're used to thinking that that kind of assertiveness is actually mean or rude or not patient centered. And so that, I mean, the whole point of this whole podcast is like, what if it is patient centered? What if it is compassionate and cooperative, as well as really good for you to know that you're not trapped in a room? All those good reasons to practice some interruption. Okay. So, um, one last sort of chunk of this podcast that I want to share are some examples of language. Because I know, like, in the moment, especially if we're very not used to it, we can kind of feel very fumbly. Maybe it'll just be like, stop talking. And you know what? That could be fine. Any words are beautiful words if they're you practicing, you're experimenting with it, you're seeing what comes out. If it's really awkward the first time, it probably will be better the next time. And the only way you can start is by starting, right? And being awkward about it. And I know it was helpful for me to hear some examples of language of how other people approach it, because in my brain, when before I started interrupting, I was like, the only thing you could say is like, stop right that. Like I was only thinking of very like what I would consider rude or unkind or uncompassionate ways of like, shut up or something, right? But instead, hearing other examples was helpful for me. So I want to share some with you. One, I would say that helps, especially if the patient is like really emotionally activated, is repeating their name. So say my patient's name's Bob. It's like, Bob, hey Bob, Bob. Especially if that doesn't immediately interrupt them, then you know, whoa, they're really activated. It's like, Bob, can we pause for a minute? Hey Bob. And like repeating that is grounding for them. That helps them come down of their like sympathetic activated state. Saying their name can be a helpful simple one. So that's one simple one. Um, Using language like pausing versus like stop. So one I've heard a lot and now use quite a bit is like, okay, let me pause you right there. And whatever you say next, but like, let me pause you right there. There's something I'm still inviting them, but I am also taking the authority of saying, let me pause you. But I'm not saying like, I need you to shut up. Let me pause you right there. And then usually I'm like, then I say why I'm pausing them. It's like, let me pause you right there. I need to clarify something. And I'm not asking them a question. So again, it is a full interruption. They hear me, but I'm explaining why. I'm not like, let me pause you right there. You are terrible. Or I'm not about to say something rude. I'm about to say something that is cooperative towards them. I need to clarify something. Maybe it's let me pause you right there. I don't want to miss anything. I would say those are two of my most common ones. Like, can I please, I would like to clarify something. I don't want to miss something important. Sometimes I do name like, I'm going to need to slow this down and go piece by piece, even speaking slower, right? Piece by piece, step by step. Otherwise, I'm nervous we'll miss something. I'm worried we'll miss something, right? So a couple things in there. So you naming, especially if it's true in your head, where you're like, this person's a lot. So I'm worried we're going to miss something if we don't take it one thing at a time, right? All of this is kind of language that shares that the reason you're interrupting and like, taking back the conversational floor a little bit, or at least asking them to share it, is for their benefit. Help, like something I do say to patients sometimes is like, I need to make sure my brain is working well and I am able to understand everything that's happening here. So like help my brain help you, right? Because whether they think of it that way or not, they want our help. They came to us because they are inhabiting the role of someone in need, and we are inhabiting the role of someone who could help them with that, right? So reminding them of that can also be a really helpful way for them to kind of say, "Oh, okay, right. Thank you." And really receive it as cooperative, which is how it's being intended, right? Another phrase is just like, hold on a minute. So again, just like hold on, pause. I find those are received in a way, I don't know if I just said stop, maybe they would be received fine. But for me and my conflict aversion, I find those sort of gentler, but still firm enough, assertive enough ways of saying it that they're effective, right? Um, yeah. And then just reminding them of why you're interrupting, like I said. So I want to really understand what's happening. I have a few ideas of what could help, but I need some more information first. Do you mind if I ask you a few yes, no questions, right? Like sometimes that where you just need like a couple like rule in, rule out things and see if they can do that yes, no part with you. Um, Say it's more closer to the end and they seem to be drifting. Like it's important to me that you understand these instructions. So can we like go over them again, or can you listen for a minute, or what's going to help you? What's going to help you focus so that we can make sure that we're on the same page? Again, using language, you say on the same page, what's can I do to help you focus in on this? I don't want you to miss this. I think this is important. And they could say, I don't care about it. And then you would stop, right? But like it's a way of still signaling like, hey, I'm one of we're in a dance together. We're trying to do this dance well. And so I'm naming my part of it and the reasons why I'm changing my moves up over on my side of the room. So you have an understanding. It's a leadership quality to lead them through the dance so that they not only feel seen and heard, but have an understanding and a structure of what's even going on, right? So those were some like verbal examples of cooperative interrupting. I will name these, sometimes these don't work. I would say the main reasons they don't work is because I don't deploy them. But also there are some patients because of cognitive conditions they have or personality stuff or whatever, where I will use all of these and they continue to speak, right? And so I do want to name that it's not like any magic spell will pause any person, because people have urgency to their communication for lots of reasons. And so the last line of cooperative compassion interrupting is phoning a friend. So the one that I use pretty regularly just for a couple patients where I know I'm still working on if there's a way to hold space for them while containing our time in a way that just feels cooperative for both of us. And so I will ask my nurse, whether it's a nurse or a medical office assistant or like someone on your team, ask them like, can you knock on my door 30 minutes into this encounter? So I have an out. So I can be like, oh, just a minute. And then I can like pause myself, ground myself, and then maybe not go back in. Sometimes they'll open the door and be like, you know what? That's actually the end of our time. And we actually were wrapping up. So here's some things I printed from the printer and on off you go. Or at least gives me a chance to like re-engage and then go back in and say, you know what? I've just realized we're near the end of our time here. So let's start summarizing what we're doing next. Right. So having that knock on the door as an outside compassion interruption, very helpful. If you don't have anyone to knock on your door, you can always fake a phone call, like have someone actually call you, set an alarm, but it sounds like a ringtone. And then you just are like, oh, got to take this call, but it's an alarm. Like, if you have to, if that's what helps you from feeling trapped, I actually encourage you to do it. Cause like the main thesis underneath this whole cooperative compassion interruption episode is if you are feeling trapped with your patients, that is not serving you or your patients. And so, one whole methodology I'm talking about of how to feel less trapped is by giving yourself permission to experiment with some cooperative interruptions with your mouth, but also with your phone or your staff. Right. Okay. I think that's it. I'm going to, in the show notes, include a link to that study just because I think it's kind of great in case you want it for yourself or to send to a friend. And I would love to know if you found this topic helpful. I would love to know if you have a particular like phrase that you like using with this sort of cooperative, compassionate interrupting. Yeah. And if there's any other parts, any other things that make you feel trapped in a room with a patient, then I'm happy to talk more about those on a future episode. In the meantime, remember, you're the other human in the room. Remember that I'm rooting for you. And yeah, I'll talk to you next time.